I will take just a few moments to introduce my colleague and today's presenter. John Beatty is a certified genealogist. He has been with the department a good number of years. I think John and I are the two veterans in the department as far as tenure of service. John is very interested in thorough research. He is our chief bibliographer, so he also has a keen interest in building a really remarkable collection that we have here for researchers. His topic this evening is using the Genealogical Proof Standard and DNA as power tools to really help us in our research. So John, I'm going to go off camera and turn it over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Last February, I gave a talk on how to use the Genealogical Proof Standard and DNA evidence together as power tools as a potential for unlocking brick walls that we have in our family. And I promised at the time that I would do a follow-up, which is what we're doing now. You don't have to have attended the February talk to follow along tonight, because what we're going to be doing is looking at some different case studies from what I used before and show you how I've used both the GPS and DNA to solve a very complex problem. So I hopefully, with the talk tonight, I'll give you some ideas of how you can use these tools for you as well. So every genealogist faces a brick wall of one form or another in his or her research. We all go back to ancestors at some point in time and can't get back any further. There may be no reliable family histories, no census records, no wills, no deeds, no court records that resolve the parentage of an ancestor in question. Well, we might look at the public trees on Ancestry, but how sure can we be of any of the information that we find on there? So what do we do in those instances? We need to think systematically about the evidence we are uncovering, its quality, its reliability, and what sorts of conclusions we can reliably draw from that evidence. The Genealogical Proof Standard, when used with DNA, can sometimes give us answers. So these are some of what I would call the genealogist power tools. This is not the Genealogical Proof Standard, which I'll get to in a minute. But having a sound research methodology, of which the GPS is part of, it means conducting research, not doing lookups, taking an analytical approach to problem solving, understanding of the records that were created at the time of your ancestors, the place and the legal framework in which they were created. That's kind of important, because sometimes it's easy to pull off a book on the shelf and say, what is this? Not really understanding fully what it's telling you. And it's important to put our ancestors into the context of the times, understand what kinds of records were being created around them, where they lived at the time they lived. And finally, the effective use of DNA evidence, both Y-line DNA evidence and autosomal DNA evidence and mitochondrial DNA. So what is the Genealogical Proof Standard? This is something that's been promoted by the Board for Certification of Genealogists, and it's what I follow as a certified genealogist. You don't have to be one to use this. You don't have to be a professional to use this, but it will help you as you do your research. And it's considered the best practices that genealogists should follow when conducting genealogical investigations. Step one is conduct reasonably exhaustive research. We will talk a little bit about what meets this standard of reasonably exhaustive in our case study. Step two, provide complete and accurate citations for all the records and sources we use. You might ask, well, why do I need that? I'm not planning to publish my research. However, if you get into the habit of keeping good records of the evidence that you uncover, it will actually help us in evaluating the evidence that we do uncover. By keeping an exact record of what sources we examine, we can easily find them again if we need to reproduce them, if we find new evidence, or to defend the conclusions that we've reached. And it will help us not to spin our wheels over and over again if we keep a good record of what we've looked at. Step three is I think the hardest part of the GPS, which is test through a process of evaluation and analysis and correlation all sources of information that we uncover. I will show you how this is done. It is a crucial aspect of doing research. We evaluate the sources that we have found, we give them different weights, and we assimilate all the evidence together very carefully. Step four is we resolve any conflicts of the evidence that we found. Inevitably, in all the research that is comprehensive, there will be record conflicts. A birth date on a tombstone may not match the recorded age on a census or a church record. A person may be known by different names or name variants and so on. If we find no record conflicts, we have not likely conducted reasonably exhaustive research. And step 5 is to write a coherently reasoned conclusion based on all the evidence that we've been covered. The act of writing, I promise you, will actually strengthen your evaluative skills because you have to grapple with them as you write down your conclusions. Even if you don't publish what you write, it's still a crucial step in this process. So what is a reasonably exhaustive research? That was the first plank of this. And what does it mean? Reasonable and exhaustive seem to be really subjective terms, and they are. First, it is not a fixed concept, but it's flexible depending on the type of research being done and the availability of resources that address the question. Some people think that if you look at 3 different sources, 3 being the magic number, and find that same information, you have exhaustively researched the item in question. That is faulty reasoning. All 3 pieces of evidence may derive from the same wrong source. So reasonable and exhaustive together means doing whatever it takes to reach a sound conclusion by using a variety of sources, both original and derivative, direct and indirect, to reach a sound conclusion. All conclusions are subject to change or revision based on the discovery of new information. And there are such things as spheres of research. And I talked about this in my talk last February. And I'm paraphrasing, but I think that it's useful to think of these different spheres as we try to gather evidence and try to put together a research plan that attacks a particular research question. So one of the spheres is, excuse me, we want to look for quality original records from multiple sources that were created independently and are not derivative of one another. We need to understand the context of those sources. Second, we want to search for family and friends, associates, and neighbors. That's what we call the fan principle. So when an ancestor had a deed or appears on a census record, or maybe he had died and had an estate record, we want to make note of all the people that live nearby on the census. We want to look at the people who witnessed his will or his deeds. We want to look at the people around them in the neighborhood. If there were godparents in a church record, we want to make note of those people. And we want to look for the neighbors because these were his fan clubs. These are the people that he knew and interacted with. And some of those people can, if we study them, can help us solve a very complex question. If we can't find an answer in our own records for our own ancestor, if we trace his neighbors, maybe they came from the same place, maybe they associated with other people with the same name as your ancestor, and that can help us untangle a very complex problem. Number 3, we want to look deeply at all record sources for the area, even unindexed records. That means going through court records, deed records, any type of record that would cover the area where the ancestor lived. And it's also, and step 4 is maybe looking for relevant sources in various jurisdictions. For example, someone may live in one county in South Carolina, but the court that covered that particular county may have been based in Charleston. And you may not think to look there for records that might be pertaining to that particular county. So it means understanding the different jurisdictions of courts and how a record might be in a different place that covers the area that your ancestor lived. So we want to explore all those relevant data sources that may be not immediately relevant or not relevant, but not readily apparent when you're looking for your ancestor. We repeat steps 1 through 4 for every locality where your ancestor lived. If he moved across the country, we want to apply these same principles. Finally, we want to research the entire extended family of the targeted ancestor, children, grandchildren, siblings, cousins, second cousins. Look at their children, look for patterns, look for connections, and DNA where applicable. Oh, that's a very hard process, you might think. Why do I want to research a whole family? But doing a whole family research can sometimes really help us eliminate different lines where a family we know isn't where your ancestor fits, and it allows us to focus on more specific places where your family might fit. And that's what we want to be doing when we're trying to solve a complex problem. Think of it as consecutive circles, all those different spheres, those 4 different spheres, and the sweet spot's in the middle. And we want to really try to see where all those different spheres dovetail into the sweet spot, where the targeted information is. And there's different types of genealogical evidence out there. Direct evidence is evidence that directly addresses the matter at hand and offers us an answer. It may or may not be complete or even accurate. It may come from an original or a derivative source, but it directly answers the question. For example, a death certificate might show the names of parents. Those parents' names may be wrong, but it's direct evidence for the parents of the individual. Indirect evidence does not provide a specific answer, but it may support or refute direct evidence. When accumulated, it can be convincing in the absence of direct evidence or resolve errors in direct evidence. So having a lot of accumulated indirect evidence can be very powerful as a tool for solving an ancestral problem. And when you have a brick wall, it may be solved through indirect evidence rather than direct evidence, because there may be no documents that tell the parents of the person involved. Negative evidence is the absence of a record that should exist. So if, for example, you find someone living in a 1900 city directory, but they're not on the 1900 census, that's negative evidence. That means that the person should have appeared on the census, but they don't, and for some reason, and we have to try to account for that as to why someone may have been missed. So those are the 3 types of evidence we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to be looking at a case study and discussing a case from my own genealogy, showing how I used both the Genealogical Proof Standard and DNA to solve a long-standing brick wall. If you remember from my talk last February, I used some examples from my wife's genealogy. This time I'm going to show you a problem from my own genealogy, a problem that has confounded researchers going back to the 1930s. Before I lay out the problem, I need to give you a little background and talk about the DNA project involving this family. So my ancestor, Joseph Vick, was born in England, we think, of around 1640. We don't have an exact date because there's no baptismal record for him in England. He came to Virginia probably in the 1760s. Certainly were there by the 1770s. He settled in Isle of Wight County, Virginia, which is in the south side of Virginia. And he died sometime probably before 1700 because he does not appear on a 1704 tax roll. He left his mark, a little circle on a document. That's his only example of his signature. Joseph had 5 known sons: Richard, John, Robert, Joseph Jr., and William. They all lived in Isle of Wight County and later in Southampton County, Virginia, which was created out of Isle of Wight County in the 1750s. And all of them left many descendants who spread throughout the South in the time period between the 1700s and the 1900s. Many descendants remain in Virginia, but many of them also spread out to everywhere else. And they also, all 5 of them have male line descendants, which makes it a perfect family to study for Y DNA. So my question, the problem that I have is, who were the parents of my 3rd great-grandfather, Eben Vick, who was born in North Carolina in 1792. He does not appear in any known record until he was an adult. And at that time he was in Franklin County, North Carolina, with his wife's family, and also later in Logan County, Kentucky, where he moved in 1821. He does not appear in wills, in probate records, in deeds, or in court records anywhere in North Carolina, and I've done exhaustive searches. I've done reasonably exhaustive research. No apparent clues come forward about his parents. So how did he descend from Joseph, if at all? But what we found is this name Vick is a pretty unusual name, and almost all of them that I found in the South are connected in some way to Joseph Vick. It's not like we're dealing with Smith or Jones or some really common name here. It's a fairly unusual name, which means that this whole family sort of connects together like a one complex puzzle. So we apply the reasonably exhaustive standard here. And when I began working on this family in the 1990s, we did not have DNA evidence to work with. So in an effort to conduct reasonably exhaustive research, I looked intensively at this family, and I wanted to find where Eben fit So I did a whole family genealogy. I studied all the descendants of all 5 brothers, trying to put their families together using all the records I possibly could, looking at the brothers, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren through about 5 generations. I looked at deeds, wills, probate records, court records, military records. We had a big family organization, and many of the family members had family Bibles. I looked at vital records, such as they were for the South. Cemeteries, when I first did this project, were hard to find. We didn't have Find a Grave back in those days, and there weren't very many cemetery compilations in print for the South, for the areas that I was researching. But the family association I had brought together people for large regular family reunions. We still have them once a year. And of course, the Facebook nowadays has been a great tool. We have a Facebook page for our family organization, and that reaches lots of descendants and uncovers lots of new information for us nowadays, but we didn't have that back in the 1990s. So I began working on this, and I actually put together a book in 2004 called Joseph Vick of Lower Parish, Isle of Wight County, Virginia, and His Descendants. And I tried to fit Eben into where I thought he best fit into the book. We made all kinds of mistakes in this because we didn't have the kind of digitized sources that we have today. We had to use microfilms that we borrowed from Salt Lake City, and it was hard research to do to find information. Sources weren't indexed very well, and of course, so we made mistakes, and we made some errors in where we connected people. And I put my Eben Vick in what I thought was his father, but it was ended up being wrong. I had the right grandparents, but not the right father. And so the book came out as flawed as it was, but it was the best we could do at the time. But I still want to underscore here the value of doing a whole family genealogical study, even with the flaws that we had in our book. It was a comprehensive review of all the early records that we could find at the time. I've since found more. It identifies lines with well-established evidence, and it showed me where the gaps were in this particular family, where the evidence was scant, where there was room for more people to fit, and it helped with the identification of multiple family members with the same name. And to this day, I find people who have attributed on Ancestry and in various lines a certain person with a certain name, attributing wrong parents with them because they haven't really done what I consider a whole family genealogical study and determined that actually there were multiple people with the same given name that had multiple different spots they fit in the family. And so doing a whole family genealogical study will alert you to where those possibilities are, that there are multiple men named John Vick, that there are multiple men named Jordan Vick, and that they don't all fit together. And a marriage record you find in Virginia doesn't apply to the same guy that was in North Carolina. And so that's the sort of thing that a whole family genealogical study will do for you. So I highly recommend it. Now, with DNA available, it's really changed the whole picture for us, and it really it highlighted for me the mistake that I made in my genealogy, that my Eben Vick could not have been a male line descendant of Joseph Vick. We did a study. Many different Vick men took tests, and we still have a very active Y-DNA Vick group with Family Tree DNA in Houston, Texas. And we discovered that Joseph Vick had a very unusual haplotype called haplogroup QM242. It's just 0.5% of men in England today have it. Slightly higher in Scotland, but not much higher. It originated in the Altai Mountains in Central Asia about 30,000 years ago. It may be associated with the Huns, like Attila the Hun, and there were certain branches of it that branched off and came into Scandinavia, but other parts of it went further into Asia, into Siberia, into other parts of Western Asia. And so you'll find the Q haplogroup spread all over Asia, which makes it kind of unusual and interesting to study an American family with this group. When we talk about what are subclades are SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, that are it's a $20 word that we use when we're dealing with Y-DNA. And when a person has a haplotype, there are different SNPs that are part of that haplotype that show the evolution of that person downward in time. These are called subclades. They're downstream from the original subclade, or the original haplotype. So if QM242 existed around 31,000 years ago, then there was another descendant of that group that started having a SNP called QL257. And he lived about 15,000 years ago, and he moved from central Siberia into Scandinavia, probably with the Vikings. And then another group from him descended, had another mutation, which was QY4827. And then another one had a group called QY4813, which was associated with the Vikings in Scandinavia, probably brought to England with that group. And we know that our Joseph subclade, our descendants of this man, has another further downstream subclade called QFGC6995, and it's about 800 years old. So there are, understanding these subclades is what you'll see when you take a Y DNA test, especially what we call a big Y DNA test with family tree DNA. It's a fairly expensive test, but we'll talk more about that in a minute, but we'll give you a lot of refinement in your Y DNA, and we'll show you a lot of different permutations of it, which is good for doing genealogy when you're trying to distinguish people that have the same common ancestry. There is actually a family tree DNA group called Q Nordic. They have a group that goes back to that QL257 subclade, which is right in the middle, which is when Q first came into Western Europe. And it's a discussion group. They talk about what means to be QL257. They talk about other permutations of it. They talk about the geographical distribution of it. So it's an online group, and you may find in your DNA group, whatever one you're part of, that there are discussion groups like this out there that will help you and will help you discuss and refine your results from your Big Y 700 test if you take one of those tests with family tree DNA. So as most of you who have done Y DNA testing know, there are two types of measurements that derive from the study of a Y chromosome, which are passed down in the direct male line of a family. We've been talking about SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. They're called SNPs, or SNPs for short, and they determine the haplotype and the subclade to which a man belongs. And the Big Y 700 testing at Family Tree DNA will refine these SNPs and will identify many different ones and many different subclades to which the person will fit into. There are thousands of SNPs in a single Y chromosome. The second measurement is called the short tandem repeat, or the STR for short. It measures numerically the number of repeats at a given marker on the chromosome. By studying these numbers, one can determine the degree of relatedness between two men within a given haplotype. We want to find as many different STRs as we can that occurred within a genealogical time frame to help us differentiate different branches of the same family. Again, the Big Y test will identify 700 STRs, which is really helpful. Since all of Joseph Vick's descendants are positive for the SNP QFGC69995, the goal of the Vick Y DNA project then is to look for more differentiation within the men that have taken the test, so we can figure out which branches had mutations that just exist in that particular sub-branch of the family. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is a tree showing Joseph Vick, and it shows his SNP FGC6995, which is part of Q. And then it shows some of his sons, and it shows some of the SNPs that are, and as well as STRs that are unique to the sons that differentiate one son from the descendants of another son. And this is what we want to find when we're doing a project like this. So we'll talk more about this in a minute. You'll notice that Matthew, who is the son of the Joseph Jr., he has a number of STRs that his brother James did not have. And so Matthew's descendants, both Matthew and James, share the same one that their father had, but James's descendants didn't have the ones that Matthew has. So we know if someone comes into the group now and has one of the STRs that Matthew has, we can put him almost certainly under that that line, rather instead of any of the other lines in the group. Same way for Richard 3, which we see under Richard Jr., which is Richard's son. He has a unique STR under his group called DYS 449, which is a value of 30, 30 repeats, which no other descendant in the family has. So if someone has that in their, when they take their test, we can know exactly that they fit precisely under that person. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. When you have a Y-DNA project, you're going to get STR values that these numbers that you see in these columns are repeat values that go to specific markers that are identified at the top of the page. And I think the screen might get partially blocked here, but the chart that we have identifies each one of the STRs that are points essentially on the Y chromosome, and it tells you how many repeats are on that particular chromosome for a particular descendant. And so you notice, for example, that where the arrow is at the top right there, that there's an STR called YGTAA10, kind of a long number, but every single one of Richard's descendants, Richard is the oldest son of Joseph, has a value of 11 repeats at that number. All the other brothers from Joseph have 12 repeats. So we know that that's a defining number for all the descendants of Richard. Now we want to look for even more refinement among his descendants. So we can look for Richard Jr., which I told you about on the other chart there. And if you go to the top arrow on the left, you'll see some men who descend from Richard's son, Richard Jr., then through his son Benjamin, and then John, Nathan, and so on. And you'll notice over in the column, the third column over, which is where the number 30 is, which is DYS DYS 449, all of them have the number 30, 30 repeats, whereas the other brothers have 29 repeats. So that, again, that's a refinement that allows that grandson of Richard had that number, and that allows us to plug that in. Same way further down, if you look a little further, there's a Joshua there, that's where the middle arrow is, and he was a Revolutionary War soldier, and he has a value of 32 repeats at another DYS marker. And another son named Giles down there, he has 22 repeats at another marker. So by doing this, we've been able to really break down the DNA evidence that we have, the Y-DNA evidence, and allow us to plug people into specific groups. So even if they can't get back so far in their research with using regular sources, and sometimes this happens too with descendants of African Americans who may have had a white event, a non-paternal event that happened, which happened often during slavery times, where whites had children with their African American female slaves. We've been able to identify the line where that person fits in several instances. So it's been really cool allowing this work to go forward because of what the data has shown us, because we've been able to break it down so far. Another son, Robert, has two markers for his descendants that one is at 26 repeats, the number is 30 repeats at two different STRs. And that allows us to help us uncover some real interesting situations. We have people come into the family who don't have the Vick name at all, but they find that their ancestor was a Vick. They find that a non-paternal event happened, that someone, and may have been a case where a woman a Vick woman may have had a child with someone else, which means they don't have the Vick haplotype at all. Or they may be a situation where a woman had a different name. She had an affair with the neighbor who was a Vick and had a child with him, and that child then has the surname of the married husband, but has the DNA of the person that the wife had the affair with. And that's what happened with this Barry Holland that you'll see down here. He is his descendants come down. He was an ancestor that lived in the 1840s. He has Holland descendants today living, but when they took the test, several of them found that they have a Vick Y-DNA haplotype. And we've been able to determine, because they have these two numbers in their columns, that their ancestor was definitely a descendant of Robert, the son Robert. And we've been able to narrow it down to two different men, brothers, who is the likely father of this man who was born back in 1840. This will help in situations of illegitimacy when it happens, and it can be a surprise to people when they find this out in their families. So non-paternal events, as I say, there are Vicks who don't match the Joseph Vick M242 haplotype, which is the case with my ancestor Eben Vick. There could be a break in terms of adoption. Someone may have adopted into a family, or a Vick woman may have given birth to sons that carry her last name. They're still descendants of Joseph, but not in the male line. And that's what we're going to find out was indeed the case with Eben, because he is a descendant of Joseph, but not in the male line. And DNA, both autosomal DNA and Y DNA, was what we'll use together to help break that through that barrier. So what do we know about Eben Vick? And it's good to try to put together a timeline and put together some basics about what we know about him. We know he was born in 1792 in North Carolina because he lived to the 1850 census, and he gave North Carolina as his birthplace. He died in 1860 in Logan County, Kentucky. He appears on the 1860 mortality schedule. He died of dropsy. He married around 1820. We don't have a marriage record for him, but he married a woman from Franklin County, North Carolina, named Elizabeth Carr, and her family had been in Franklin County for a number of generations. He does not match the Joseph Vick haplotype. My maternal great grandmother was a Vick, my maternal grandfather's mother, and so I had to recruit some second cousins of my mother who were Vick descendants to take DNA tests. They're both deceased now, but they were able to, by taking those tests, we were able to determine for sure that that Eben was not in the Joseph Vick male line. So who were his parents? That's the mystery I wanted to solve. That was my whole book wrong, and that was the problem. So we have to apply our reasonably exhaustive research, and here's where it's important, because if we follow the genealogical proof standard, we can't rely solely on DNA evidence to solve the problem. We have to have a paper trail. We have to do whole family research. We have to narrow our focus like I did with the book, and it will still pay off even if some of the details are wrong. We want to look for all clues from all sources, primary sources, secondary sources, online clues, everything, because there may be a clue there that we're missing. And we don't want to be snobs. We want to look at everything we can to help identify our problem. Construct a timeline can really be helpful. So we know that there are no records of him having done exhaustive research. There's no records of him between 1792 and 1820. In 1821, he made a number of land purchases in Logan County, Kentucky. He had money. He was able to sign his name. So he doesn't seem to have been poor. He came into the county with enough money to buy a number of tracts of land. In 1827, when his father-in-law died, there was a probate settlement in Franklin County, and Eben was named as a son-in-law. He appears on the 1830, 1840, and 1850 censuses in Logan County, Kentucky, and in the 1860 mortality schedule. He appears in deeds in Logan County when he bought quite a bit of land, and he sold some, and he also acted as a mortgager for some people, which shows he had enough money to mortgage, to help others obtain mortgages for their property. So he was not a poor man, and he was certainly literate, which is clues about his background. Here is an example of the probate settlement of him in Franklin County, North Carolina, showing him with his wife Elizabeth and his mother-in-law Mary Carr, and the other Carr heirs that were part of that estate settlement. That's the only deed I can find of him anywhere in North Carolina. So we want to look for all of the clues here and do exhaustive researches, which I've done. We want to look for the fan principle. We want to look for friends, neighbors, and associates. That ended up being not very helpful for my case, because I had no fans for him in North Carolina, and the fans that he had in Kentucky, Logan County, were not very helpful. None of them came from the same area, and it didn't really pan out. Doing the whole family genealogy was helpful because it identified certain pockets within the Vick family descendants where I found gaps, where I found not a lot of evidence, where I found, for example, a person, which I'll talk about in a minute, where he said, I give my property to all my children, but he only named 2 children in his will. So that alerts us to the fact that there were probably more children, including daughters, that were not named in the will at all, that were around. So looking for clues like that when you're doing a broad family study gives us some places where, some slots where we might be able to plug in a particular person. And finally, we want to look at naming patterns, because naming patterns in this case were very important in solving the problem. So Eben and his wife Elizabeth have these children: Martha, John J., Elias Carr, who's named for his father-in-law, Presley William, who is my great-great-grandfather, Mary, a son named Eben Nelms, a son named James Council, a son Marmaduke, a son Henry, and a son Samuel Owen. Well, a couple of those names, middle names, look like Council and Nelms and Owen, look like they could be last names being used as middle names. And so those are really interesting to us. We want to make sure we make a record of those. But we don't really know for sure what we can do with them yet. We still have lots of questions since Eben was illegitimate. Who was his father? And if so, why did he have the Vick last name? If he was born to a Vick mother, would autosomal and Y DNA together help us identify his birth parents? So that's what we're going to work on. And we have theories. Our theory is that Eben Vick was the illegitimate son of a daughter, unnamed, of Benjamin Vick and his wife Mary, who lived in Halifax County, North Carolina. And Halifax was adjoining to Franklin County, where Eben's wife's family lived. Perhaps her name was Martha, since he gave that name to his eldest daughter, but we can't be sure. So we want to test the theory. We try to identify everything we can about Benjamin Vick's family in Halifax County. And in my book that had a lot of wrong information in it, I was able to identify Benjamin as the likely grandfather, just because there were so many gaps among his children that it seemed like that was the slot where he would most likely fit, because the other families I was finding, I was able to really conclusively write them off and finish them up, because there were really complete records of wills and deeds and things for those families. And so I was able to eliminate a lot of different Vick lines and identify only the ones that I think were, only a couple that I thought where he could possibly fit. I looked at all the available documents, 1770 to 1820, and wondered whether Benjamin could have had a daughter who could have been Eben's mother. And this is where we want to do our whole research, our whole family research. And we look at Benjamin Vick's will, and he says, equally divided among all my children in his deed, even though he mentions only a son Benjamin and a son Josiah in there, and his wife Mary. So it alerts you when you see a will like this that there are more children at play here in this family that we're not able to account for in the documents that we have. We look at the state census that was taken in North Carolina in 1784, and Mary Vick, the widow, appears there, and you'll notice that there's a white male in her household, either under 21 or above 60, and there are 7 women in the household in 1784, which alerts us to the possibility that there are daughters. And similarly, we have this 1790 census here that we see Mary Vick there. She has 1 male under 16 and 5 females in her household in 1790. In 1800, the last year that the widow Mary appears, there is, in fact, a boy in the household under 10, which certainly fits the possibility for Eben Vick. If he was the illegitimate child of a daughter of this family, there's a male in the household that could be him. We can't be 100% sure who he is, but he was there. There was a girl under 10, 2 women 16 to 25, 3 women 16 to 44, and a woman who is 45 and over, who was probably Mary. So again, a lot of women in the household. We don't know their names, but at least we have, by doing this kind of research, we've identified the possibilities here for daughters being in this family. So we do autosomal DNA, and with the appearance of the through lines that have since come out in Ancestry, and I didn't have anything like this in the 1990s when I was doing research, or even in the early 2000s, I was able to find some connections here with people who descend from the proven lines of Benjamin Vick, with whom I share centimorgans. Autosomal DNA is measured by what we call centimorgans. They're segments that we share with others. And the higher the number of centimorgans, the greater degree of relatedness usually, or that the more chromosome sections of chromosomes are being shared. So we notice, for example, that we go here. This is another descendant chart that I've shown just to highlight this. These are the lines down from Benjamin the lines that I'd come down through, me and my brother and our second cousin, who come down from Eben. And then there's another brother named Josiah, and I have 3 descendants of him with whom I share autosomal DNA. And then I have 2 descendants from Benjamin Jr., who also I share autosomal DNA with. So this is enough varied information that I think here that there's enough to work with here that we can start doing some comparison analysis of the centimorgans. And so when we look at these centimorgans, we do a chart like this, and we want to compare. I compare myself with several people on here, and it shows the number of segments that I share, 1 or 2. A couple instances there's 2, a couple instances there's only 1. With my second cousin, I have 215 centimorgans and 8 segments that I share with. I didn't bother putting my brother because we have thousands, but my brother shares some of the same segments with some of these people, and conclusively, my second cousin shares some segments, 2 segments with one of the people on the list, which tells us then that the connection with these people does indeed come through that particular line, that my brother and I aren't sharing this through some other line. So it really helps us refine this in such a way that we can tell that we share these centimorgan segments with the Vick line. And this is part of the chart that I'm using as part of a book that I'm coming out with. So our first conclusion then, that's tentatively, is that autosomal DNA evidence indicates that Eben is probably a grandson of Benjamin and Mary through an unnamed daughter. We still don't have her name. The indirect evidence supports that Benjamin had multiple daughters that were not named in his will, and the name of daughter may never be known due to the lack of records. This was a poor family, and there's a lot of missing records in Halifax County that might have identified him. There are missing court records from the 1790s that might have produced a bastardy bond. If he had been born illegitimate, they would have identified the father. But since there are no court records, I can't search them. And I've searched the court records of the surrounding counties and come up with nothing. Franklin County's records are also missing. So we have some lost records that make it difficult to find a textual record that would support our theory. So finding Eben's father presents a lot more obstacles. I've alluded to the obstacles with finding bastardy in other cases. As I say, there are no bastardy bonds for Halifax or Franklin for the period, in this period. The court records where bastardy bonds exist are non-extant. So finding the biological father will be challenging. In testing Eben's Y DNA, I thought it was important to test multiple descendants from multiple children. So the 2 second cousins of my mother that we tested were descendants of Presley, but it was very important for us to find another child of Eben to also test to make sure there isn't a match, because it's possible, for example, that Presley was illegitimate, but James was not illegitimate, and then he could have matched back to Joseph Vick, but that was not the case. We were able to find a descendant of one of the brothers and test him, and he matched the 2 other descendants of Presley. So we now know pretty conclusively, because we've tested 2 different sons, that we have a pretty good idea of what Eben's haplotype was, and that it's definitely not the Vick haplotype. Okay, so it's good to try to diversify your testing and include more than one. Ideally, I'd love to test more, but we've conclusively tested it. There was another descendant who thought he was a descendant of James Council Vick, who didn't match the 2 descendants that I had, and it alerted us to a problem. I said, who is this? But it turns out that descendant had another non-paternal event further down in the line. And so he wasn't a descendant of James Council Vick at all, that there was another illegitimacy in the line that broke that DNA up. So it can get complicated when you do these kinds of tests. We tested 37 markers initially, but then we upgraded to 67 markers. And these two men are deceased, so I can show their names. We show that they matched. They were off at one marker between each other, but they certainly were matches. They were cousins of each other. So at 37 markers, they were at 36 out of 37. And when we added this third person, we found that he matched both of them, and we were able to find that they we were able to do a big Y test for this third test taker because the other two men were dead. We couldn't upgrade the DNA, but with this third test taker who is alive, and I've shielded his name, we were able to do a big Y test and test a lot more markers. And with that test, we were able to find some interesting discoveries. And one of the discoveries was that we found that he matched two men whose last name was Nelms. One of those Nelms men also matched one of the other cousins that I tested. And so this tells us that that the name, the paternal line name, might be a Nelms, because this is the male line that we have. There is no Nelms Y-DNA project like there is for Vick's. And so we don't really have a huge number of Nelms men who have tested, even though this is an old colonial family that goes way back. There hasn't been much interest among the Nelms descendants, and there aren't many Nelms descendants, so they haven't really done a lot of DNA testing, which would have been interesting to alert us to some things. So the earliest, one of them had an earliest ancestor named William Nelms, who was born about 1805, and we haven't been able to trace him back further. The other Nelms man has not done any of his genealogy, so we weren't able to really trace his line. But that Nelms name was coming out at us with two different matches. And remember, back in our names of Eben's children, that he had a son named Eben Nelms Vick, and Nelms was a middle name. So that was really interesting to us, that we found some Y DNA matches and had the Nelms name. So the Nelms family was way back into Virginia. It came into Northumberland County, Virginia in the 1600s. There was a man named Richard Nelms that came over, had a number of children, just like the Vicks had a number of children, lots of descendants initially. We looked to try to figure out where the Nelms family might have come in to Eben Vick's line. And so we looked at the census records, and we found that Elias Carr, who was the father-in-law of Eben's wife, Elizabeth Carr, was living just a few doors away from Presley Nelms, who lived in Franklin County, North Carolina. And remember that Eben Vick had a son named Presley Vick. So we looked at will, and there are deeds from this Presley Nelms who owned land on what was called Sandy Creek, in what was then Butte County, but later became Franklin County, which is exactly the same place where the Carr family lived. So the Nelmses and the Carrs were definitely neighbors of each other on the exact same creek in Franklin County. And the older Presley Nelms left a will in 1797, and he named two sons, a son Presley Jr. and a son Eben Nelms. He was a wealthy planter. We thought possibly that he could be the father of Eben Vick, but he was an old, frail man by the time of the 1790s. We found out that during the Revolutionary War, he gave a cart with 4 horses and a slave to General Horatio Gates to use for the Revolutionary War Army in North Carolina, and the cart and the slave were lost at a battle in North Carolina. And in the 1790s, he was trying to claim compensation for the loss, and he was too old to even come to the state legislature to make the claim. So we know he was a feeble man and quite elderly by the 1790s. So we know he couldn't be the father, but maybe either Presley Nelms or Eben Nelms, who were young men, could have been the father of Eben Vick. So that was a will we had, and we found, for example, too, an estate. This is actually the Robert Carr estate inventory. He was the grandfather of Elizabeth Carr, the wife of Eben Vick, and Eben Nelms was one of the purchasers, along with Elias Carr, at the estate sale. So again, this gets into our fan principle. We're using our DNA evidence, and we're also using our our genealogical proof standard to look for our friends, neighbors, and associates. And so we do autosomal DNA, and it turns out that this is my through line on Ancestry, and I have a number of descendants that I match through the through lines, some through other children of this elderly Presley Nelms, as well as a descendant through Presley Nelms himself and Presley Nelms Jr. And so this is a chart that sort of shows the descendants of this elderly Presley Nelms, who was too old to be the father. He had two daughters, Winifred and Anne, and a son, Presley Jr. And you see my line there, and you see these other lines that come down from him. I tested 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other people. And again, I did a centimorgans chart showing the amount of centimorgans. And these are pretty strong centimorgan matches. These are actually stronger than some of the Vick matches I had. I had 15 segments, 15 centimorgans on one segment, 16 centimorgans on 2 segments for these half sixth cousins of mine, and one for a 4th cousin. So rather interesting. And it showed really strong enough, I think, indication that the Nelms family that we connect through, that shows up in the Y-DNA evidence, that we do also have autosomal evidence that shows where we fit, and that these Nelmses here in Franklin County were the Nelmses that were the father of my guy. It was either Eben or Presley Jr. And Eben never married. He never had children. It was a lifelong bachelor. And whereas Presley Jr. did marry and did have children, we guessed that perhaps Presley Jr. was the father rather than Eben, because he never had any children, that he's the most likely candidate for the father. So that's basically our second conclusion, that Eben Vick was the out-of-wedlock son of either Presley Nelms Jr. or Eben Nelms. We have no direct textual evidence that says this, no bastardy bonds, but we do have strong autosomal DNA evidence, and we have supportive Y-DNA evidence. So we, with both the DNA of the autosomal and the Y together, we're able to put together a conclusion here. And I want to introduce you to my 4th great grandfather, Presley Nelms Jr. Here's a picture of him. He was born in 1767. He was a rough contemporary of Andrew Jackson. He moved from Franklin County to Anson County, North Carolina. He was a large slave owner. He had 70-some slaves in 1840, when he died in 1841. And there are accounts of him being sort of this, that are overly flattering of him, but we don't know the circumstances of how he had Eben Vick with a Vick woman. We don't know what brought them together or what happened exactly, but it's an interesting story that we've been through this long process. I've been able to bring him back to me, and he's my oldest photograph of an ancestor, my only 4th great grandfather that I have a picture of. So some concluding thoughts here as you try to apply the model that I've talked to you about with your own research. Problems lines require a combination of evidence to solve. You may need to use both the genealogical proof standard. I think you always need to use the genealogical proof standard, but you also may need to use both kinds of DNA together to solve a problem. And you have to get a lot of luck in there too. DNA evidence can be difficult to obtain from people, but it is available now on Ancestry, as well as Myheritage, as well as 23andMe. You should have enough autosomal DNA samples to support your theory to eliminate competing hypotheses. The body of evidence you gather should point to one conclusion as the obvious answer, which is what we've done here tonight. We've shown that the Y-DNA points back to Nelms. We've shown the autosomal DNA points to Nelms. We've also shown autosomal DNA points to where the Vick family connects. So be creative, but thorough in your research. And that's my talk. And if I can answer any questions, I'll be glad to do that. So I will stop my share. I'll go back on screen here and go back on camera and come back on with my camera. Let's see the video. There I am. Okay.
Very, very good, John. I think you had our participants, very studied and following you along the way. We do have a number of questions. I'm going to start out with the briefer ones first, just to let you catch your breath a little bit. Mary writes, what can be done when there are no known surviving males in the line?
That's tough, but so that can be really difficult. You'll have to rely solely on autosomal in that case, and you'll have to be try to get as wide a variety of autosomal evidence from people in that same line that descend from that line, and look at it very carefully. And that's makes your strategy much more difficult.
Okay, thank you. Melanie writes, with Y DNA, would each of a man's sons have a unique STR that the other sons don't have, or may some not have a unique STR?
Yes, it could be the case. It happens, but sometimes you'll find brothers have the same STRs. It really depends. But if you do a really big Y test of two brothers, you will probably find something that distinguishes one from the other. It's some slight mutation somewhere or another. But I've also seen this, and I don't know if it can be demonstrated, but often when an older father has children, they're more likely for STRs to happen than if there's a younger father having sons. So you'll more likely find mutations in that line if you have a 40-plus-year-old man having a child rather than a 20-plus-year-old man having a child. So look for that as a possibility too. But it's really not worth it for two brothers to test like that. But you see in the Vick family, though, that there were distinguishing characteristics in those brothers. So it can happen.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Rita writes, in the reference to Berry, B-E-R-R-Y, and B-A-R-R-Y, Holland, what level of Y DNA test was used? What was the minimum level of Y DNA that would have provided the answer to the parentage?
In that case, those two men that are both deceased now tested with some other company, and this was done in the early 2000s. And one of them lived long enough to test longer and to do an upgrade on the test. The other one had died, and so but the one we were able to test, I think they were able to get up to a 67 marker match. Okay. With that, we were able to find those two, or even I think we maybe done a targeted search for just those two markers. You can do a targeted search for just those two markers to try to figure out if he fit there, and they were able to do that. I'm not the project coordinator of this. We have a guy who knows more about this than I do, but he's worked with these families when this DNA evidence comes in. Sure. And he's been phenomenal and is helping counsel families and deal with this evidence when it comes in. And when he finds these things, it alerts us. It helps me, the genealogist, to troubleshoot it and put it into the family. So I work on the record side, he works on the DNA side, and we're a team working together on this.
Okay, very good. Two more quick questions here as we're heading toward the bottom of the hour. Did you use 23andMe or Myheritage to compare DNA results with relatives? And did you use DNA Painter?
I've used DNA Painter, and I've drawn from all three of those. I have tested with all three: Ancestry, 23andMe, and Myheritage, and I used all three of them with DNA Painter. For the Vicks, I have found a little bit of where I think they fit, but for my Vick study, we used pretty much we used family tree DNA and the autosomal results from Ancestry.
Okay, very good. What suggestion would you give to someone who has done the big Y test and didn't have a single match?
Well, be patient. You're fishing. Remember, you're casting your line out into the ocean, and you may not have a bite right away, but you'll eventually get one. I have a situation where I have an ancestor who showed up in Kentucky who was illegitimate, doesn't match anybody. We tested in this thing. We think his father might have been a Revolutionary War soldier because he was born in the Waxhaws area of South Carolina in 1782, right when the battles were going on, and we can't find his father, and doesn't match other people with that name. So we're hoping someday we'll have a match, and just by getting the information out there and doing a big Y test, even if you don't have a match today, keep looking, because something will come along.
Very good advice. Thanks for that, John. The final question is someone is asking if you're available to consult. And he indicates, or she indicates, that she has a very similar situation. She's looking for some direction and advice. I can answer that question. That is, please send us an email. Send an email to genealogy@acpl.info. And John and some of our other colleagues will take a look at it and be happy to provide you with some advice and counsel. Thank you so much, John, for a really methodical, good presentation, taking those two really important things, DNA test results and the GPS, and bringing them together and kind of methodologically walking us through that process. A really good talk, a lot of good positive comments in the chat. So thank you for that presentation. And thank all of you for joining us this evening. Please join us again on Tuesday or a week from today on Thursday evening for another round of great virtual presentations. Good luck in your genealogical research. As John advised, stay at it, be patient, and continue to stay at it. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you and good evening.